The first thing Commander Cale Marin noticed when he woke up was that he was breathing recycled air that tasted like copper and burnt polymer. And the second thing he noticed was that his dead brother was talking to him again. "You've got about 40 seconds before the restraint field degrades," said the voice behind his left eye. Not in his ear, not through a speaker. Behind his eye, inside the architecture of his prefrontal cortex, where the neural echo of Sergeant First Class Davin Marin had been living for the past 18 months like a quiet tenant who occasionally banged on the walls. Cale didn't answer out loud. He'd learned early not to do that. He moved his eyes to the left. The private signal they'd developed, the one that meant, "Confirmed, I hear you. Keep talking." And Davin kept talking. "The restraint emitter is mounted at the ceiling junction, northeast corner, the one the Veth guard checks every 12 minutes. He checked it 4 minutes ago. You've got 8 minutes total before he loops back, 40 seconds to get the field down, 2 minutes to the access corridor, 5 minutes to reach the armory node before the patrol rotation. That gives you 40 seconds of margin. Don't waste it on sentiment." Cale closed his eyes once, understood, and started working. The Veth detention block aboard the cruiser, Ascendant Mercy, was not designed with human physiology in mind, which was the only reason Cale was still alive. The restraint field was calibrated to immobilize Veth musculature, the dense, double-jointed limb structure of a species that had evolved in low-gravity ammonia, the swamps, and built an interstellar empire on the premise that physical strength was the only currency that mattered. It worked perfectly on every species in the Galactic Compact's registry. Humans were not in the Galactic Compact's registry. Humans had been in contact with the Compact for 11 years, 3 months, and 14 days, and in that entire time the Compact had managed to learn approximately nothing accurate about them. This was not entirely the Compact's fault. Humanity's first diplomatic envoy, Ambassador Priya Chen, had spent the better part of 2 years negotiating a framework agreement from a position of what she diplomatically called studied ambiguity, which in practice meant she had never once confirmed or denied any of the 17 competing theories the Compact's xenobiological division had developed about what humans actually were. The leading theory at the time of Cale's capture was that humans were a moderately advanced, warm-blooded species with reasonable intelligence, limited physical capability, and a curious cultural fixation on emotional bonding that made them unpredictable but ultimately manageable. The Veth High Council had specifically classified humanity as Category 3, supervised emergence, monitored, contained, permitted to exist at the Compact's sufferance, pending full assessment. The restraint field was designed for Category 3 species. Cale rolled his shoulders until his right collarbone, which he had deliberately dislocated 40 minutes ago, by slamming it against the wall with specific calculated force, ground back into its socket with a sound like cracking knuckles. He breathed through his nose, did not make a sound. The restraint field was pushing against his musculature, with about 900 newtons of distributed force, which under normal circumstances would have been more than enough to keep a human still. But the field was calibrated to his surface biometrics. It did not account for the fact that Cale had spent 3 years in the 14th Deep Assault Regiment training specifically for high G, zero oxygen, high-pressure environment combat, and that his autonomic system had been so thoroughly reconditioned by that training that his resting muscle tone was classified as a medical anomaly by the United Earth Defense Force's own physicians. He didn't fight the field, he breathed into it, let it read stillness, let his body report calm and compliance while his hands, moving at a rate his conscious mind barely tracked, found the seam in the freezing pylon 3 centimeters above his left wrist. 22 seconds, Davin said. The seam was a manufacturing tolerance gap in the field emitter housing, 1.3 millimeters wide, present in every Veth restraint unit of this generation, because their fabrication standard allowed it. Cale had memorized the schematics from a briefing packet 17 months ago, the week before everything went wrong. His index finger found the gap and applied lateral pressure at the precise angle that would cause the housing to flex without triggering the stress. Sensor the field flickered. Cale was off the platform before it died completely. He moved along the curved wall in a half crouch, keeping his profile low, matching the rhythm of the ventilation cycle that masked small sounds. The detention block smelled of ammonia and something sweet and vaguely wrong, the Veth equivalent of disinfectant. 3 cells down, he could hear the low harmonic hum of a Krith prisoner in distress, the sound somewhere between a barus and a subsonic vibration that he felt in his sternum rather than heard. He didn't stop for it. He couldn't stop for it. Davin would have told him if he could. Left at the junction, Davan said. The guard's at the far end. He turned away from you. You've got it. Cale turned left. He had not seen his brother's face in 18 months. He had not seen his brother's body in 18 months either, because his brother's body was somewhere in the wreckage of the research installation on Meridian Station, where the Veth Empress's special operations team had detonated a compact gravity shear device to collapse 3 levels of the facility and bury whatever evidence was inside. What had survived was the partial neural mapping that Davin had been in the process of completing as part of the UED's Experimental Companion Protocol, a field command system that digitized the tactical cognition of a senior NCO and embedded the echo in a linked officer's neural lattice. The idea was to give infantry commanders a living tactical advisor who couldn't be killed by enemy fire. The Veth had not known about the companion protocol when they destroyed Meridian Station. They had not known, in fact, about most of what humans were actually working on. They had been provided with the Category 3 assessment and had seen no reason to dig further. Category 3 species didn't develop classified neural lattice command architecture. Category 3 species didn't have soldiers who could work dislocated joints back into place silently in a restraint field, and then sprint through alien warships' maintenance corridors on 3 hours of sleep and a calorie count that would have hostilized a Veth warrior 3 times his size. Category 3 species, the Veth High Council had noted in their formal recommendation, posed no meaningful strategic threat. The recommendation had been filed 11 months ago. 11 months ago, the UEDF 7th Expeditionary Fleet had not yet existed. Cale reached the armory node in 4 minutes and 38 seconds, which was 22 seconds under Davin's estimate, which meant Davon would have something to say about it. He said it immediately. You're ahead of schedule. Don't get comfortable. The armory seal is a Veth biometric lock, 5-digit chiral sequence entry. I've been watching the guard rotation, and I have 11 of the 15 sequences. The other 4 are variables. I need you to input what I give you, and then we improvise the rest. Ready? Cale placed his palm on the lock plate and moved his thumb in the pattern Davin described. The lock read his palm and began its rejection sequence. Left 3, down 1, Davin said. They recalibrated after the last security review. The rejection sequence always starts with a visual pulse. Wait for it. There. Cale didn't fully understand what Davin was doing. He never fully understood it. What he knew was that 18 months of living as a dead man's echo inside his brother's skull had given Davon Marin a relationship to information that was not quite like anything that had a name. The neural lattice wasn't a recording. It wasn't a ghost. It was something in between. A thinking pattern that had adapted to its new environment, the way Cale's body had adapted to deep assault training, finding the angles that worked, learning the tolerances, becoming more itself the more pressure it was under. Davon had always been the smarter one. Death, or whatever this was, hadn't changed that. The armory seal opened. Inside, 3 Veth pulse carbines, a rack of compressed plasma grenades, and a sealed hard case that Cale recognized immediately because he had seen one before. In a briefing room in Geneva 2 years ago, when a UEDF intelligence officer had placed an identical case on the table and explained in a flat, careful voice what it contained and why its existence was classified at a level that had no formal name. He opened the case. Inside, packed in dampening foam, was a human neural capture device. UEDF manufacture. The serial number on the housing was in the 4000 series, which meant it had been produced in the last 8 months, which meant it was not from Meridian Station, which meant the Veth had been collecting them since Meridian Station. KL, Davin said, and his voice had the particular flat quality it got when he was managing the distance between what he knew and what he wanted to say. There are more, the manifest on the shelf behind you. I can read it from here. 7 cases total, all different serial ranges. 7 different acquisition events. 7 acquisitions. Kale stood in the cold ammonia air of the armory and let that settle into him. 7 separate operations. 7 separate moments when the Veth had encountered a human carrying the neural lattice equipment and had chosen to take it rather than destroy it, had chosen to collect it, had chosen to study it. He'd been captured 3 weeks ago when his insertion team was compromised on the Veth orbital station above the planet, Vareth 6. He'd assumed at the time that his capture was operational bad luck. A patrol route that had shifted, a sensor sweep that ran early. He'd been running the mission alone because the rest of his team had been pulled to a higher priority operation, and he was supposed to be in and out in 6 hours. He'd been captured in 4. But if the Veth had 7 of these cases, they knew, Kale said, out loud, quietly, because this was the kind of thing that needed to be said out loud. They weren't patrolling early. They were waiting for me specifically. Or for anyone carrying the lattice, Davin said, which means they've been running their own intelligence operation on the protocol. They know what it is. They know what it does. And they've been collecting components. Why? A pause. Davin didn't pause often. When he did, it meant he was integrating something that didn't fit the existing model. That he was turning it over to look at it from different angles. The Empress's project, he said finally. The one you were sent to get data on. The one that destroyed Meridian Station. I think I understand what it is now. Kale took one of the pulse carbines, checked its charge, clipped a plasma grenade to the webbing he fashioned from a restraint band, and put the neural capture case under his arm. He did not have time to hear the Davin had figured out right now, but he needed the shape of it. Give me the short version. They're not just studying human consciousness, Davin said. They're trying to replicate it, specifically the lattice link. The way human neural patterns stay coherent when they're digitized, the way they continue to develop and adapt rather than degrading. No other species they've mapped does that. When Veth do it, the pattern decays within weeks. Kreth patterns are stable but static. They don't learn, don't adapt. Human patterns don't decay and they don't stop. They keep thinking. They keep growing. They keep figuring things out. He paused again. They want to build something that runs on human minds. I don't know what yet. But that's what the project is. They're not studying us because they're curious, Kale. They're studying us because they need us. And I don't think they realize that we know that yet. Kale stood in the armory for exactly 3 more seconds. Then he moved. Ascent at Mercy was a Veth-class heavy cruiser, 1.4 kilometers of layered composite hull, 6 primary drive nacelles, a crew complement of 840 Veth warriors and support personnel, and a point defense grid that could intercept most conventional munitions within a 300-kilometer radius. It was, by Veth military doctrine, one of the most capable warships in the Compact's arsenal. It had won 7 engagements against Kreth separatist forces in the past decade. Its captain, Fleet Suzerain Orith Khan, was the recipient of the Compact's highest military honor, and had never lost a ship under his command. He had never fought humans before. The emergency klaxon that Kale triggered, by pulling the plasma grenade's release pin and rolling it into the atmospheric processing junction on Level 4, was designed by Veth engineers to produce a controlled evacuation response. The crew would follow protocol, secure critical stations, move non-essential personnel to safe zones, deploy internal response teams to the affected area. The response teams were Veth warriors in full combat kit, armed with pulse weapons, moving through corridors they knew with the calm efficiency of trained soldiers. The corridor systems, however, had been designed around Veth tactical doctrine, which held that internal threat response was essentially a matter of superior firepower and coordinated numerical advantage. The defenders would have both. The intruder. It was always assumed to be a single intruder, because no rational species would mount a solo internal assault on a warship, would be cornered, overwhelmed, and neutralized within minutes. Veth tactical doctrine did not account for Davin. Right junction in 6 seconds. 2 guards, facing each other. The one on the left hasn't finished buckling his chest plate. He's slower on the draw by about 1/3 of a second. Take him first. The one on the right will have a moment of processing delay because he'll be watching his partner fall before he reacts. You know what to do. What Kale did to the first guard took less than 2 seconds. What happened to the second guard was messier but faster. He was already moving before either of them had time to trigger a distress signal. You're angry, Davin observed, as Kale pulled the second guard's weapon and stripped the ammunition pack with practiced hands. I'm focused. The biometrics in your lattice read angry. The biometrics in my lattice are none of your business. They literally are, though. Kale almost smiled. He'd been almost smiling at things his dead brother said for 18 months. It was one of the stranger aspects of grief. He'd found that the person you were grieving could still make you almost smile, could still land the exact dry delivery that he'd had in life, could still find the 3-word rejoinder that cut through whatever you were feeling and made it briefly bearable. He didn't know if that was the neural echo being an accurate simulation or some residue of who Davin had actually been, still resident in the mathematics of how his thoughts organized themselves. He'd asked a UEDF neuroscientist about it once, and the answer had been long and inconclusive, and had involved the phrase emergent continuity of self, pattern approximately 11 times. He decided it didn't matter. Davin was Davin. That was what he had. That was enough. The communications relay on level 2 was lightly defended, because the Veth logic held that a single intruder, if he somehow got this far, would be trying to escape, not trying to broadcast. Escaping meant going to the shuttle bay. Kale went to the communications relay. The console was Veth standard architecture. He'd trained on Veth standard for 3 months before the Meridian Station mission. He brought the emergency channel up and began to compose the transmission in the 70 seconds he had before the next patrol rotation reached his corridor. He didn't encode it. That was the point. He sent it raw, clear, unencrypted, on every channel the Ascendant Mercy Caesarea could reach, in compact standard, with coordinates appended. The message was 11 words. 7 capture events. Project Holoframe is active. Humanity is coming to collect. Then he went to the shuttle bay. The pursuit caught him 2 corridors out. 4 warriors, moving fast, with a tactical formation that assumed he was trying to reach the bay in a straight line. Davand redirected him through a maintenance access that the Veth architecture maps marked as a dead end, because it was, for Veth, too narrow to traverse at combat speed. Kale was not at Veth combat width. He was through it before the lead warrior had finished recalibrating, and into the shuttle bay with 40 seconds to spare. The shuttles were Veth configuration, designed for 4 to 6 Veth crew members, controls positioned for a species with 3 fingers on each hand, a field of vision skewed 40 degrees further forward than human standard, atmospheric mix, calibrated for ammonia tolerance. Kale had trained on Veth shuttle systems for 6 days total. He'd read somewhere that the average human pilot needed 300 hours to become proficient on an unfamiliar aircraft system. He had the shuttle undocked and through the bay doors in 4 minutes. Well, Davin said, as they cleared the Ascendant Mercy. Ishal and Kale punched the emergency drive, and the acceleration hit him like a wall, and his vision grayed at the edges, and he breathed through it, controlled, disciplined, the way they'd trained him. That was either very good or were about to get destroyed. The Ascendant Mercy fired its point defense grid. The point defense grid was designed for incoming munitions, fast-moving objects with standard trajectories, a stolen shuttle making an erratic random walk exit at full emergency thrust was technically within its engagement parameters, but the targeting solution was complicated by the fact that the shuttle was moving in a pattern that Davon was generating in real time, based on 17 months of stored observations of Veth targeting behavior and the specific calibration tendencies of Mercy. Grid that he'd been noting since before Kale was even captured. 3 shots hit the shuttle's aft shielding. 1 cracked the port nacelle housing. None of them hit Kale. He made it to the relay point that he'd specified in his transmission with 12 minutes of oxygen remaining in the shuttle's reserve tanks, because the atmospheric recycler had taken a hit and was running at 30%. He spent those 12 minutes doing a detailed mechanical scan of everything the shuttle's systems could access, cross-referencing what he found with what Devon told him, building the most complete picture he could of what Project Holoframe actually was. By the time the UED interceptor, Covenant Blade, dropped out of emergency transit and locked tractor beams on the shuttle, he understood enough to know that everything had changed. The officer who met him in the Covenant Blade airlock was Captain Sarah Voss, UEDIF 7th Expeditionary, who Kale had trained alongside 7 years ago and who was currently running the infiltration network that he'd been part of before his capture. She was a compact woman with close-cropped dark hair and the kind of eyes that processed tactical information first and everything else second. And the first thing she said when she got a look at him was, "You look terrible. I feel fine. You have a cracked rib and a dislocated collarbone that you apparently relocated yourself. The rib's bruised, not cracked, and the shoulder's fine. The medical scanner disagrees. The scanner's calibrated for Veth physiology." Sarah stared at him for a moment. Then she stepped aside to let him through. "Command is waiting," she said. "What you put on that transmission?" "I know. Fleet Admiral Ewan pulled 6 ships out of the outer patrol ring when it came through." 6 ships, Marin. There are people at the Galactic Council who are going to have questions." "Good," Kale said. "The Council needs to hear this." He walked through the airlock and down the corridor, and he thought about 7 cases in foam packaging, and the particular silence of a dead man's voice saying, "I think I understand what it is now." The Galactic Compact's council chamber on Verith Prime occupied the highest level of a tower that had been constructed 11,000 years ago by a civilization whose name was no longer spoken aloud, and had been passed from empire to empire and alliance through the chaotic centuries of the galaxy's political history, because whatever species currently held it found it impossible to disagree that it was exactly the kind of place where important decisions should be made. The ceiling was 300 meters above the chamber floor. The acoustics were designed to ensure that every voice, regardless of volume, carried perfectly to every seat. The seats were arranged in concentric rings around a central presentation platform, and they were occupied by representatives of 47 species, and the weight of accumulated history in the room was a physical thing that most diplomats spent years learning not to let affect their delivery. Ambassador Priya Chen had stopped noticing it approximately 10 minutes into her first session 4 years ago, and had never found a reason to start noticing it again. "The representative of Earth is recognized," said the council moderator, a Veth elder whose scales had gone gray-white with age, and whose voice still carried enough command resonance to quiet a room of 47 species. Without effort, Priya stood. Behind her, in the gallery, the UED intelligence staff watched. Admiral Ewan, somewhere in the diplomatic section, had requested this emergency session 5 hours after receiving Kale's transmission, and had been working on the presentation since then. The relevant data was compiled. The case was airtight. Priya had reviewed all of it. She did not intend to present any of it yet. "Thank you, moderator," she said. "Before I address the substance of Earth's emergency petition, I would like to make a request." The Veth First Delegate, Suzerain Voreth Keth Mai, was a massive figure whose formal regalia indicated 3 decades of military service, and whose expression indicated that he had not slept in the past 18 hours, and that this emergency session was an indignity his digestion was struggling to process. He did not quite roll his eyes. He approximated the gesture. "The human representative has the floor," the moderator said neutrally. "I would like to ask the council," Priya said, "to invite the Empress's personal liaison to attend this session, not as a witness, as a respondent." She let that land. 47 species processed it. Earth is not here to file a complaint. We are here to ask a question, and the answer to that question determines what comes next. The chamber was quiet. The Veth first delegate leaned forward. "The human representative will clarify what is meant by what comes next." Priya smiled. It was the same smile she'd been deploying for 4 years. Composed, measured, the one that all 47 species had cataloged and analyzed, and still somehow managed to misread, because their modeled expression were based on the Category 3 assessment, which had been produced by analysts who had never spent meaningful time with a human, and had consequently decided that the smile meant contentment, or social signaling, rather than, "I have already decided how this ends, and I am giving you one more chance to catch up." "We'll get to that," she said. The Empress's liaison was a figure named Theth Oru, young for a Veth of administrative standing, with a kind of careful stillness that indicated excellent training, rather than actual calm. He arrived in the chamber 20 minutes later, took the respondent's position on the presentation platform, and stood with his hands folded in the traditional position of a Veth official who was prepared to answer questions and had been briefed to say very little. Priya walked to the platform. She did not use the podium. She stood 3 meters from the liaison and looked at him directly, which was not a gesture most non-human species aimed at each other during formal proceedings. The Veth found it aggressive. Several of the council members noted it. She knew they were noting it. "Project Holoframe," she said. "Explain it to the council." The liaison's stillness cracked slightly at the edges. Not visibly. Not to any species in the room that wasn't specifically watching for it. KL, watching from the gallery, saw it and thought, "There it is." "The representative refers to a classified Veth research initiative," the liaison said carefully. "The council would need to." 7 capture events, Priya said. She let each word have its own space. 7 separate operations in which Veth Special Forces acquired UEDV neural lattice technology. 7 separate times that human personnel were targeted, captured, and their technology removed. Over a period of 11 months, while the Veth Compact was simultaneously engaged in diplomatic normalization talks with Earth's representative, which is to say, with me, she turned to face the full council. "I would like the council to understand something. Earth was not unaware of these events. We tracked them. We documented them. We chose not to raise them in this chamber until we understood what they meant." The first delegate was on his feet. "The human representative is making an accusation against the Empresses." "I'm making a presentation," Priya said pleasantly. "The moderator can correct me if I've exceeded my floor time." The moderator said nothing. Priya continued. She laid out the case in 12 minutes. Not all of it. Not the technical details. Not the full scope of what Kale had transmitted. Not the analysis that the IEF intelligence team had been developing for the past 6 months. Just the shape. Just enough to make the council understand what had been happening in the shadow of their normalization talks, in the comfortable assumption that humanity was Category 3, and therefore manageable, in the confident belief that a species that had been in contact with the Compact for 11 years, and had not yet developed faster than light travel, was not a strategic concern. Humanity had not, in fact, developed faster than light travel. What humanity had developed was a generation of engineers who had been given a copy of Veth FTL schematics by a sympathetic Kreth separatist contact 4 years ago, and had spent those 4 years working out not just how to replicate them, but why they worked, at a fundamental physics level, and had then built something that was not quite FTL, and was not quite anything else, but was considerably faster, considerably more efficient, and considerably harder to track than Veth Standard Transit. The 7th Expeditionary Fleet had been using it for 8 months. The Council did not know that yet. Priya did not tell them yet. She wanted them to have a chance to understand the question first. "Project Holoframe," she said, returning to the liaison, who was standing very still in the particular way of someone who had been told to say very little and was now discovering that this instruction was difficult to follow. "Is, as our intelligence analysis indicates, an attempt to use human neural patterns as a power source for a weapons system the Veth Empress has been developing for the past 3 years. A system that requires a consciousness that continues to think, adapt, and generate novel solutions even under extreme duress. Human neural patterns do this. No other cataloged species does this. Veth neural patterns degrade. Kreth patterns stabilize, but stop growing. Human patterns." She paused. "Don't stop. Silence." "What you wanted," Priya said to the liaison, and her voice was quiet now, the pleasantness stripped away, "was our minds, not our bodies, not our territory, our minds. Because our minds keep thinking even when we're dead, and that frightened you, and your answer to being frightened was to try to harvest what scared you." She let that settle. Let 47 species sit with it. Then she said, "Earth's petition is this. The Council formally recognizes humanity's classification as Category 1. Full Sovereign Compact member. Effective immediately. Project Holoframe is terminated. All captured neural lattice equipment is returned, and the Veth Empress submits to a formal Council inquiry regarding violation of the non-predation compact that every member species signed at the founding of this body." She folded her hands. "In exchange, Earth does not escalate. The data we've gathered about this project remains under Earth's custodianship, not distributed to other parties. And the 7th Expeditionary Fleet, which is currently positioned at the Vareth system's edge, stands down." The chamber erupted. It took the moderator 4 minutes to restore order. The Veth First Delegate was in conversation with 3 of his aides. His gestures clipped and rapid. The Kreth delegation was making the low-frequency vibration sound that indicated intense deliberation. The Lethari observer, who had been silent for the past 11 years because they considered humans interesting, but not yet worth addressing directly, turned slowly in their seat to look at the gallery where the UDF staff was seated. Kale watched all of it. They didn't know about the fleet, Davin said, inside his skull, in the quiet voice he used when he was noting something significant. "Look at the first delegate." He knew about the transmission. Whoever briefed him mentioned Holoframe. But the fleet position is new information. They didn't scan for it. Because the drive signature doesn't match Veth transit patterns. Kale thought it, rather than said it. And because they still think we're Category 3. Thought. The first delegate, after another 4 minutes of urgent consultation, rose and addressed the moderator. His voice had changed, not in obvious ways. The command resonance was still there, the formal register of Veth High Protocol. But Kale had spent 3 weeks aboard a Veth warship, had spent 18 months building a read of Veth behavioral patterns, with the help of a dead man who never stopped analyzing, and he recognized what was underneath the formal register now. The first delegate was recalculating. "The Veth Compact," Kethmai said slowly, "quests a recess of 1 planetary rotation to consult with the Empress's office before responding to Earth's petition." Priya looked at him. Let the silence hold for exactly 3 seconds. "Of course," she said. In the gallery, Admiral Ewan pulled out a tablet and sent a short message, 240 light minutes away, at the edge of the Vareth system. The 7th Expeditionary Fleet received it and held position. Kale left the gallery and found a corridor that was empty, and sat on the floor with his back against the wall, and closed his eyes and let himself be still for a moment. "Fine. Your cortisol just spiked." I said fine. A pause. Then, in a different register, gentler, "It worked. We'll see." "No, it worked, Kale. The first delegates recalculating because the fleet position was real. They're going to come back with something different than they walked in with. They might hold on some points. They'll fight the inquiry. They'll argue the Category 1 to classification needs a process and a timeline. But the fundamental position, they're going to move, because they understand now that we understand them. They can't operate on the assumption that we don't know what we know. Cale opened his eyes and looked at the ceiling. The ceiling in this corridor was plain composite, nothing like the council chamber 300 meters above him. Practical, utilitarian. You said the neural patterns keep thinking even when they're dead, he said. You were listening. Priya borrowed it. She improved on it. There was something in Davin's voice that wasn't quite what it sounded like. Not quite pride, not quite grief, not quite the particular ache of something that had existed and still existed, and did not know what name to give itself. She said, keep thinking even when we're dead. I would have just said they don't decay. You're the tactics guy, she's the words guy. I know. I just pause. It's a strange thing to hear your own situation described as a rhetorical point. I know it is. Cale put his head back against the wall. Somewhere above him, the most significant diplomatic session in human history was in recess, and the outcome of that session would determine whether humanity spent the next century as a junior partner in an alien political structure, or as a sovereign nation on the same terms as species that had been crossing the stars for 11,000 years, and he had been awake for approximately 31 hours and had dislocated and relocated a collarbone and stolen a Veth shuttle. And he was tired in the way that went deeper than sleep. But Davan was still talking, still thinking, still there, and that was its own kind of answer to something. The recess lasted not one planetary rotation, but 18 hours. And in those 18 hours, 3 things happened that no one outside a small circle had anticipated. The first was that the Veth Empress's personal envoy, not the liaison Theth Oru, a different figure entirely, one whose clearance level was several tiers above anything that had appeared in the chamber, arrived at the UEDF diplomatic suite and requested a private meeting with Commander Cale, Marin specifically. The second was that the Kreth delegation sent a formal message to Ambassador Chen indicating that 3 Kreth member states wished to register a separate complaint against the Veth Compact related to similar unauthorized acquisition activities, which meant that Project Holoframe had not been limited to human neural lattice technology, which changed the scope of the Council inquiry considerably. The third was that a UEDF signals team monitoring the Verath system's subspace channels intercepted a tight beam transmission from the Veth military command hub that used an encryption standard that should not, technically, have been crackable by human intelligence assets. It was crackable because Davan, over the past 18 months, had been systematically deconstructing Veth encryption architecture from the inside, working from pattern observations compiled during his time aboard the Ascendant Mercy and various other Veth systems he'd accessed through Cale's neural lattice. The transmission contained tactical orders. The orders were addressed to a Veth battle group, currently positioned 2 transit jumps from the Verath system. The orders described a contingency operation. The operation had a name. The name was Final Category. Cale read the transcript of the intercepted transmission twice. Then he went to the private meeting with the Empress's envoy. The envoy was a Veth female of advanced age, which in Veth terms meant her scales had the particular deep bronze of extreme long life, and her eyes had the quality of someone who had seen enough political history that very little surprised her anymore. She was introduced as an Administrator Venon Soth. She sat across from Cale in a room that had been swept for surveillance twice, once by the UEDF team and once by whatever the Empress's people had sent ahead. And she looked at him for a long moment before speaking. You transmitted from the Ascendant Mercy, she said. That was deliberate. Yes. You could have encoded it. You had access to the communications relay. You chose not to. I wanted everyone to hear it, Cale said. Not just the people with the right decryption keys. Van Soth studied him. Her gaze had the quality of a tactical scan. Not unfriendly, but thorough. The Empress's position is that Project Holoframe was a research initiative, not a hostile act. The neural lattice acquisitions were 7 acquisitions, Kale said. I was there for the 7th one. The Empress's position is that the acquisitions were non-lethal intelligence gathering operations. No human personnel were killed. 3 were injured. 1 had permanent neural damage from the lattice removal process. A pause. The Empress expresses regret for the injuries. Kale looked at her. He kept his face neutral. He'd been trained in Veth, reading well enough to know that Van Soth was not lying. The phrase, expresses regret, was specific Veth formal language for a genuine acknowledgement of harm, not a political deflection. The Empress, or whoever had drafted this position, had made a deliberate choice to use that phrase. What does the Empress want? He said. What any strategist wants when they realize they've misjudged a situation, Van Soth said. To understand what they're actually dealing with. She placed a data chip on the table between them. Project Holoframe's research logs, she said. Everything we found. Everything we tried to understand. Everything we couldn't. She looked at him steadily. The Empress wants to know what it is. What you are. Not categorically. Not category 1 or 3. Not a threat level or an assessment ranking. What you actually are. Your neural patterns don't degrade. Your soldiers work their own broken bodies back into function in conditions that would kill my best warriors. Your ambassador stands in front of 47 species and recalibrates the entire political situation in 12 minutes, and she does it with a smile. And we cannot read the smile, Commander. We have tried. We cannot read it. She pushed the chip slightly closer. That frightens us, and we are not. She paused, and the pause was genuine, accustomed to being frightened. Kale looked at the chip. He thought about 7 cases in foam packaging. He thought about a dead man inside his skull, who had spent 18 months figuring out Veth, encryption architecture, because that was what Davenmern did, found the problem, and worked it until it gave way, because giving up was not a mode he had ever installed. He thought about the transmission sitting in the UED signals room. Final category. I need to tell you something, he said, and then I need you to pass it to whoever in the Empress's command is running the battle group currently, positioned at Keth Junction, 2 transit jumps from here. I need you to pass it before the council reconvenes. Van Soth's expression did not change, but her stillness deepened slightly. Go ahead, she said. We intercepted the final category. Orders, Kale said. We've been reading your command channel for 6 months. If that battle group moves, the 7th Expeditionary will engage. I am not, he said, before she could speak, threatening you. I am telling you what happens. Because you said you want to know what you're dealing with. Part of what you're dealing with is that we are very good at not dying when we shouldn't survive, and we are very good at finding the problem and working it until it gives, and we are very good at deciding that something is going to happen and then making it happen. And part of what you're dealing with is that we have been doing this for 11 years, quietly, not because we were afraid of you, but because we were trying to figure out what was fair to ask for. He picked up the data chip, held it. We don't want a war, he said. We never wanted a war. We wanted to be treated like what we are, which is a species that has been crossing its own oceans and digging up its own, dead and wiring its own broken minds together, and coming back from the edge for approximately 300,000 years, and has not stopped doing any of those things, and does not intend to stop. He set the chip back down. Tell the Empress that the smile means we've already decided how this ends, and that how it ends can be good for everyone if the battle group stays where it is. Van Soth sat for a moment. Then she picked up the chip. I'll relay the message, she said. She left. Kale sat in the quiet room and felt Davin turn everything over on the inside of his skull, integrating, adjusting, running projections in whatever way a digitized consciousness ran projections when the stakes were high enough. That was good, Davin said finally. You're biased. I'm objective. I'm literally a neural pattern. I don't have the cortisol spike problem. You have the problem of being my dead brother. That's a different problem. Do you think she'll pass it in time? I think she came here because the Empress already knew about the intercept. Because she's smart enough to know we'd be monitoring the channel, and smart enough to send someone senior enough to listen properly. The battle group was the card. She wanted to have pulled before the council reconvenes. Vane Soth's whole role here was to give us the chance to pull it. Another pause. You got smarter while I was dead, Davin said. You got more talkative. Same thing. The council reconvened 16 hours after the recess began. The chamber had the quality of a room in which a great deal had already been decided, not in the formal deliberation seats, but in corridors and private suites, in the conversations that were the real architecture of any political structure's decision-making. The first delegate arrived without his usual adjutants. Vane Soth was present in the Veth diplomatic section, which was unusual and noted by everyone. The battle group had not moved. Ambassador Priya Chen returned to the presentation platform. She was wearing the same suit she'd worn 18 hours ago, which was a calculated choice. The message being that she had not needed to go away and prepare a different approach, that the approach she'd arrived with was the one she intended to see through. Earth thanks the Council for the recess, she said. Before we proceed to the formal responses, I'd like to say something briefly that is not part of the official record. The moderator indicated assent. We understand, Priya said, that what we represent is uncomfortable. New things usually are. We spent 11 years being new, presenting ourselves carefully, trying not to cause alarm, trying to give the compact time to process what humanity was before we asked for anything substantial. She looked around the chamber. We thought that was the right approach. We thought patience was what was needed. We may have been wrong about that. Patience from a position that looks like weakness tends to invite the kind of behavior that brought us here. We should have been clearer, earlier, about what we actually are. She paused. We are not Category 3, she said. We never were. We are a species that has been fighting its own mortality since before your oldest civilizations built their first towers. And we are not done, and we are not planning to be done. And what you saw in Project Holoframe's data, the patterns that don't degrade, the minds that keep thinking under pressure, that is not an anomaly or a biological accident. That is what we decided to be, over hundreds of thousands of years of deciding not to stop. We are asking for recognition of that. Nothing more and nothing less. She took a breath. We are also asking that the 7 human beings whose neural patterns were captured in Project Holoframe's acquisition operations be fully restored and returned to Earth's custody, along with all copies of their map patterns, under Council oversight. Her voice did not change register. Those are not data points. Those are people, and we want them back. The chamber was very quiet. The first delegate rose. He stood for a moment without speaking, which was unusual enough that several of the older council members shifted in their seats. When he spoke, his voice was in a register that Kale, watching from the gallery again, feeling Davin pay close attention, recognized as the Veth formal mode of sincere address. Not the political register, not the diplomatic register, the one that was used when you were speaking as yourself, rather than as your position. The Veth Compact, Kethmai said, acknowledges the failures outlined in this session. The Compact acknowledges that the Category 3 classification was an error, and that the error was made in willful disregard of sufficient contrary evidence. He paused. The Compact acknowledges that Project Holoframe violated the Non-Predation Compact. The Compact acknowledges that humanity's request for Category 1 recognition is consistent with the evidence and with the principles of this body. Another pause. The Compact requests that the formal transition process, which by the Charter requires a minimum of 60 days for full integration, be initiated immediately and conducted transparently under Council oversight. He sat. Priya waited precisely 2 seconds. Earth accepts those terms, she said. and thanks the first delegate for his clarity. The Lethari observer, who had been silent for 11 years, turned again toward the gallery where the UEDF staff was seated. Slowly, deliberately, when it spoke, its voice was a low harmonic that most species translation systems rendered as significant acknowledgement. The translation that appeared on Kale's gallery earpiece was more specific. "We have been waiting," the Lethari said, "to see what you would do when you stopped being careful. It is as we expected. We would like to speak with your people formally, when you have a moment." Kale sat in the gallery and let himself feel the thing that had been building for 3 weeks and 3 years. And however many years before that, the long accumulating weight of everything humanity had been quietly doing, while everyone else assumed they knew what humanity was. "Hey," Davin said, "I know. I know." He sat with it for a minute. The chamber below was erupting into the particular productive chaos of 47 species, beginning to process a fundamental recalibration of a status quo that had existed for a long time. The first delegate was in conversation with Van Soth. The Kreth delegation's secondary contact was already at the human diplomatic section's table. The moderator was calling the session into a procedural hold to allow subcommittees to begin the Category 1 integration process. The 7th Expeditionary Fleet was still at position, standing down now. The signal had gone through an hour ago. "The 7 people," Davin said, "from Holoframe. I know we'll get them. I know you will." A pause. "Kale." "Yeah, the patterns that don't degrade, that keep thinking, keep growing. Yeah, I'm one of those." The simplicity of it hit harder than anything else had in the past 3 weeks. Harder than the restraint field. Harder than the transmission. Harder than everything that had happened in that chamber. Because it was just true. It was just the plain and present fact of what Davin was. Not a ghost, not a recording, not an echo in any static sense of the word. A mind that had found a new topology to exist in, and had kept thinking and kept being itself, and kept being Davin, fully and stubbornly, and with that exact delivery, forever apparently, or as close to forever as the architecture allowed. "Yeah," Kale said, "you are." The work, of course, was not over with a council vote. It was not over with the 7th Expeditionary standing down, or the initiation of the Category 1 integration process, or even with the formal council inquiry into Project Holoframe, which took 11 weeks to convene properly, and produced a 600-page finding that the Compact's news services spent 3 months summarizing. The work was the kind that doesn't end in a single session or a single moment. The kind that requires years, that has setbacks, that demands the same attention and precision at year 7 that it demanded on day 1. But day 1 had happened, and that was not nothing. The 7 people whose patterns had been captured in Holoframe were returned in week 4 of the integration process, with the neural capture cases, under council oversight, in a formal ceremony that Priya Chen conducted with the same composed precision she brought to everything, and which the Veth delegation's body language, carefully watched, carefully interpreted, indicated was being received as intended. The injuries from the lattice removal were treatable. The neural damage was harder. UEDF medical protocols, developed in parallel with the companion protocol research that had produced Davin's situation, were able to restore most function in 5 of the 7. The other 2 required longer care. They received it. Spent the months following the council session in what UEDF designated as debriefing, and what was, in practice, a combination of formal intelligence documentation, and the long, slow work of putting himself back together after 3 weeks of captivity, and the preceding 18 months of operating in a state of sustained controlled crisis. He was good at the formal documentation. The other work was harder. What helped, consistently and without fail, was that Davin was still talking. Not always about tactics, not always about intelligence assessments, or Veth encryption architecture, or the probability distributions on various political outcomes. Sometimes about their parents, about specific meals their mother had made, about the particular quality of light on a lake they'd gone to as children, About the time Davin had convinced a very large dog that it was afraid of him by refusing to acknowledge it as a threat until it believed him. About small things, trivial things, the texture of an ordinary life that had not been ordinary and was not ordinary now, but was still, stubbornly, life. "I've been thinking," Davin said one evening, in the room that Cale had been assigned on the Covenant Blade. Pending his return to Earth, while outside the ship the stars moved in the particular way that happened. When you were in transit and everything. Outside was a smear of light, constant, Cale said, about what the Lethari said, about waiting to see what you would do when you stopped being careful. What about it? They've been out here for how long? 50,000 years? 60? They've seen species come and go. They've seen empires built and collapsed. They chose to say something after 11 years of silence, a pause. I think they recognize something. I think what we are looks like something they've seen before, or maybe something they've never seen before, but have been watching for. And they've decided, it's time to tell us they've noticed. Cale thought about it. What do you think they see? I think they see a species that decided a long time ago that it wasn't going to accept the constraints of its circumstances. That looked at the hard limit, the thing that says, here is where you stop, here is what you cannot cross, here is the wall at the end of what living things get to have, and decided not to believe it. Davin was quiet for a moment, and then kept not believing it, for 300,000 years, and is apparently still not done. That's a pretty generous read. I have unlimited processing time. I can afford generous reads. Cale stretched out on the bunk and stared at the ceiling, and felt the hum of the drive through the hull, and thought about 11 years of studied ambiguity and 7 cases in foam packaging, and a 12-minute presentation, and a smile that 47 species had never learned to read correctly. Devon? Yeah. When we get back to Earth, I want to go to the lake. A pause. Then warm and simple and exactly the voice of his brother. Yeah, let's do that. The Category 1 integration took 23 months in total. Earth's formal seat at the Galactic Compact Council was confirmed in a session attended by delegations from every member species, several of whom had traveled extraordinary distances specifically to be present. The Lethari attended in person, their first physical appearance at a council session in over 3,000 years, which the diplomatic community regarded as a statement of some significance and spent considerable energy interpreting. The Lethari, when asked what it meant, produced a translation that came out as, "It seemed important to witness," which was not more or less specific than most things the Lethari said, but felt right. Priya Chen gave a brief address. It was not 12 minutes. It was 4. She did not use prepared remarks. She said that Earth was grateful to be here, that it had always intended to be here, that it was glad the path had not required more damage than it had, and that humanity was, as it had always been, very interested in what came next. She sat. The first delegate, Keth Mai, rose from his seat and made a gesture that was not in the standard Veth diplomatic register. It was older than the formal register, pre-compact, something that the Veth cultural scholars would later identify as a gesture of peer acknowledgement, used between warriors of equal standing, not seen in formal settings for approximately 900 years. The chamber marked it. Cale watched from the gallery. He was in UEDV dress uniform for the first time in nearly 2 years, and the uniform felt formal in the way things feel formal when they've earned the right to be. The intelligence community around him was watching the vote count. He was watching the chamber itself, the quality of it, the way 47 species sat with the accumulated weight of 11,000 years of history, and held space for something new. "How's it feel?" Davon asked. Cale looked at the central platform, where the vote was being recorded, where humanity's single formal seat was being prepared, where the evidence of a very long patience and a very stubborn refusal and a very specific kind of human insistence was becoming an official fact. Like something that already happened, he said, and we're just catching up to it. Yeah, Davin said. That's what it feels like. The vote was unanimous. Outside the tower, on the surface of Vareth Prime, the sun was rising on a planet that had hosted empires for 11,000 years, and had never, in all that time, had a human stand on its surface as a peer rather than a guest. The light came in at a low angle, the way morning light does everywhere, filtered through a sky that was the wrong shade of blue, too green at the edges, too pale in the middle, and the buildings of the compact's capital threw long shadows across streets that had been old before Earth's first cities were built. A runner from the UD staff came to find Kale before the session officially ended. A message from the medical team. The last two holoframe survivors had both shown significant improvement in the past week. One was expected to make a full recovery. The other's prognosis was cautiously optimistic. Kale passed it to Davon without comment. "Good," Davon said. "Yeah." They sat with that for a moment. The session below was moving into its formal ratification sequence. The translation feeds were rendering 47 languages versions of yes, and, affirmed, hand, recognized, and, agreed. The Lethari observer was still watching, and something in the angle of their attention felt like the particular quality of a very old eye, seeing a pattern it had been watching for become complete. The vote finished. The chamber erupted, not in the managed chaos of a political session, recalibrating, but in something older and less managed. The sound of 47 species, encountering something unexpected, and deciding it was good. Kale stood up. He straightened his uniform jacket. He was already thinking about the operational framework, about the intelligence architecture that would need to be rebuilt, now that the studied ambiguity was no longer necessary, about the 7 neural capture cases, and what they meant for the companion protocol's future, about the Lethari's request for formal talks and what that would reveal. There was a great deal to do. There was always a great deal to do. But for this moment, right now, in this gallery on this morning, on this planet that had not expected them. "Davon," he said. "Here, we did it. We did it," his brother said. And then, with the particular warmth that a dead man had managed to keep, across 18 months of crisis and grief, and the strange new country of being something that had no name, in the simple voice of someone who had never stopped being exactly who he was. "I knew we would." Kale stood in the gallery while the chamber below ratified humanity's place in the stars. And he felt for the first time in a very long time something close to what peace feels like, when it's been earned rather than assumed, when it comes at the end of a long road and not the beginning of a short one, when it knows what it cost and carries that knowledge gently, the way you carry something that matters. Outside, on Vareth Prime, the sun continued to rise. It was, by the calendar of a planet 200 light-years from here, a Tuesday. Humans had always been better at Tuesdays than anyone gave them credit for. The formal integration period began on a Wednesday, which Kale noted, because Davon had once told him that Wednesdays were the most structurally honest day of the week. They didn't pretend to be a beginning like Monday, or a promise like Friday, or an ending like Sunday. They were just the middle of a thing, which was where most real work happened. The UEDF established its formal compact liaison office on Vareth Prime. Within 3 weeks of the vote, the building assigned to them was a secondary wing of the diplomatic quarter, which had housed 17 different species delegations over the past 2,000 years, and whose walls, if you knew what to look for, still showed traces of 11 different architectural philosophies applied sequentially by occupants, who had each been convinced that their configuration was the permanent one. Kale found that detail quietly funny, in a way he couldn't entirely explain. He was assigned as the liaison office's senior intelligence attaché, which in practice meant he was the person who sat in rooms where VETH officials and UEDF officers were trying to build working trust on a foundation of recent mutual revelation, and who made sure that when the conversation drifted toward the comfortable fiction that the past 18 months hadn't happened, someone was present to note pleasantly that they had. He was good at this. Davon helped. "The suzerain on your left," Davin said, in the middle of a briefing on the Hollow Frame Inquiry's preliminary findings, is lying about the acquisition timeline. Not strategically. I don't think he's protecting anyone specific. I think he genuinely doesn't know what he doesn't know. His access level in the Empress's command structure was probably 2 tiers below the operational planning. He believes what he's saying. Kale processed this without changing his expression, which was something he'd gotten considerably better at over the past year and a half. He noted it, filed it. When the briefing moved to cross-examination, he asked the suzerain questions that approached the timeline from its edges, rather than its center. Questions that a 2-tier bellow access level would be able to answer accurately. The answers corroborated Davin's read. The discrepancy was an information gap, not a cover, which meant it could be addressed with documentation rather than interrogation. Afterward, in the corridor, Captain Voss fell into step beside him. She had transferred to the liaison office 2 weeks after him, which she described as a coincidence, and which Kale was 90% sure was not. You do that thing, she said, where you ask the question you already know the answer to from the angle that makes it possible for them to answer honestly. How long have you been doing that? A while. Is it the lattice? He considered the question. The lattice helps. Mostly it's just paying attention. Voss looked at him sideways. She had the kind of face that was very good at not showing what it was thinking, which was why she was very good at her job, and which occasionally made her the only person in a room whose expression Kale actually found difficult to read. You know what the Veth medical team's assessment was of your neural interface. When they finally got proper scans, they ran it 3 times because the first 2 results didn't make sense. I know. The pattern density is about 40% higher than standard companion protocol baseline. They thought the equipment was malfunctioning. I know. The UEDF team had the same initial read. What does that mean? Kale thought about the lake, about Tuesday mornings, about the long months of crisis that had somehow not diminished what was resident in the lattice, but had done the opposite. It means he's been busy, he said. Which was not a complete answer, and they both knew it, and Voss accepted it with the particular grace of someone who had learned that some answers were not available yet, and would be eventually, and that forcing them accomplished nothing. The Hollow Frame Inquiry produced its final findings in month 11. The findings were thorough, unsparing, and in several respects, worse than the preliminary summary had suggested. The acquisition operations had been running for 14 months, not 11. There had been a 15th potential operation that had been aborted when the council session made continuation untenable. The original project design had anticipated needing approximately 40 neural lattice captures to achieve sufficient data volume for the weapons system's consciousness substrate. 40 captures, 40 human beings. The Empress did not attend the inquiry. She sent Vane Soth, and Vane Soth answered every question with a precision and completeness that suggested she had decided, at some point between the private meeting with Kale and the inquiry's convening, that the only viable path for the Veth Compact's long-term position was one that did not involve any further acts of studied ignorance. She was not warm about it. She was accurate. In the political vocabulary of the Compact, accuracy delivered in full and on the record was the closest equivalent to an apology that a senior Veth administrator could offer without sacrificing the institutional face of the Empress's office. It was not enough. Kale did not expect it to be enough, and he did not pretend it was. The inquiry's findings were logged in the Council's permanent record, which was the oldest and most scrupulously maintained record-keeping system in the Compact, and which had never once in 11,000 years had an entry modified or removed. The 14 months of Holoframe, the 15 planned operations, the 40 intended captures, all of it was in the record now, permanently, in the institutional memory of a body that had been managing galactic politics since before Earth's first cities. It would not be forgotten. That was the point. What was also in the record increasingly was everything else. The 7th Expeditionary's transit drive, properly documented now, because secrecy was less valuable than the credibility that came from putting it on the table honestly. The companion protocol's full scope, shared with the Compact's medical council, under a joint research framework that the Lethari had proposed, and that turned out to be the first substantive conversation between Lethari and anyone else in over 200 years, which the Compact's diplomatic community regarded as one of the stranger outcomes of the whole sequence of events, and which Kale thought was maybe the most important one. The UEDF's full military capability assessment, which produced exactly the reaction among Compact military analysts that it was designed to produce: not fear, not aggression, but the specific recalibration that comes from understanding that your model of a situation was substantially wrong, and that the actual situation is more interesting than the model. The Compact had never had a Category 1 admission that involved this much simultaneous revelation. The process had precedents, but the precedents were old, and the situations had been different. Species that were already known quantities, already mapped, already understood. Humanity's admission was the first in the Compact's history where the admittee arrived simultaneously with the information that they had been significantly misunderstood for the entire period of their contact with the body they were joining. The Lethari, in their first formal session with the UEDF team, offered the observation that this was not a coincidence, that the studied ambiguity of Earth's diplomatic approach had been a deliberate strategy of information control, and that the timing of its dissolution, precisely calibrated to a moment of genuine crisis that required humanity to reveal its actual capabilities or face unacceptable consequences, had been skillfully managed, that it was, in the Lethari's assessment, the most sophisticated long-duration diplomatic approach they had observed in their 6,000 years of watching Compact politics. Ambassador Chen, who was present for this session, received this observation with the particular, composed attention she brought to everything, and said, simply, "We had good reasons to be careful." The Lethari observer's translation system rendered what came next as, "We know," and then added something that took the human translation team 3 days to properly render, because the Lethari language had tense structures that didn't directly map to any human language's grammar. The best approximation they arrived at was, "We saw you deciding, across all the time you were deciding, and we recognized the quality of the decision. And we were patient with you in return, because species that decide to be careful until they understand what is fair to ask for deserve patience." Priya sat with that for a long time. Kale heard about it secondhand, and sat with it too. The months turned. The integration process moved through its stages. The UEDF opened 3 additional liaison offices in the Compact's outer ring systems, staffed with officers who had specifically trained for cross-species engagement, and who were, almost without exception, better at it than anyone had predicted they would be. Because it turned out that humans were genuinely very interested in other species, interested in a specific way, not taxonomically, not strategically, but as entities with inner lives worth understanding, which was not how most Compact species approached cross-species interaction, and which produced a quality of engagement that was consistently noted as unusual. Several Veth junior officers who were assigned to work with the UEDF liaison teams reported, in their performance assessments, that the humans asked a disproportionate number of questions that appeared to serve no strategic purpose, and that the questions were often personal, about the officers' families, their cultural practices, what they ate for meals, what games their children played. These reports were initially flagged as behavioral anomalies requiring explanation. The explanation that the assessors eventually settled on was the least satisfying, but most accurate one available. The humans were just curious. They wanted to know. The wanting was not instrumental. It was the thing itself. The Veth had a word for this quality. It translated approximately as unguarded interest. And it was considered, in Veth culture, a juvenile trait. The kind of openness that adults were expected to outgrow. The fact that the humans had apparently not outgrown it, at any stage of their development, as a species or as individuals, was one of the things that Project Holoframe's researchers had noted and had not known what to do with. It was in the research logs that Van Soth had handed Kale in that quiet room. Page 11 of the initial xenobehavioral assessment. The subjects display unguarded interest in researchers and in each other with a frequency that cannot be explained by social signaling functions alone. Current hypothesis, structural feature of species psychology, significance, unclear. The significance, Kale thought, was everything, but that was the kind of thing that was easier to show than to explain. In month 14, the Creeth member states' complaint against the Veth Compact was formally resolved, producing a set of remediation agreements and a restructuring of the Compact's intelligence oversight framework that had been needed for decades, and which Priya Chen had quietly supported at every procedural step, not because it was Earth's primary concern, but because a compact with stronger institutional safeguards was a compact in which humanity's place was more secure. The Veth First Delegate, who by now had developed something that was not quite friendship with the UEDF senior staff, but was the working proximity to it that comes from sitting in difficult rooms together long enough, acknowledged this in a private meeting, and did not pretend he hadn't noticed it. "You play a longer game than we expected," he said. "We've had practice," Priya said. In month 17, Kale received a communication from the UED medical team lead on the Holoframe's survivors. The last two patients, whose recoveries had been the most uncertain, had both cleared their final assessments. Both were expected to return to full function. The neural damage was resolved. All 7, Davin said. All 7. There was a pause that had a particular quality to it. Not silence, but the something more than silence that Kale had learned to recognize as Davin integrating a piece of information that mattered in a way that went below the tactical level. "Good," Davin said, finally. Simple and complete. In month 23, Kale stood in the council chamber for the formal ratification and watched the vote and felt what he'd said he would feel, like catching up to something that had already happened. And then it was over. And the work was not over. And outside the tower the sun was rising on Vareth Prime, and he had a message to send home. He sent it to his parents first. That was a rule he'd made for himself 18 months ago, and had kept. His parents had been told only that he was on an extended classified assignment. They had not been told about the capture or the escape or the transmission or the council session. His mother, who had been a teacher for 30 years, and who had the particular patience of someone who had spent 3 decades watching young people figure out who they were, had responded to every check-in with the same message. "We know, come home when you can." He called them from his bunk on the Covenant Blade as the ship began its transit back toward Earth. His father answered first, and then his mother came to the screen, and neither of them said anything for a moment. And that was fine. That was more than fine. "Davin sends his love," Kale said. His mother did not look surprised. His father looked unsurprised in a different way. The way of someone who had been told the broad outlines of the companion protocol and had spent months sitting with what that meant for the son he had buried, empty in a ceremony for which nobody had been available. "Tell him," his mother said, "to stop scaring us." "I'll tell him you said that. And tell him." She stopped, looked at the screen, at her living son's face, at the thread of bioluminescence behind his left eye, that she couldn't quite see from this distance, but that she knew was there. "Tell him we have his room, if he ever needs to." She stopped again. "I know," Kale said. "I'll tell him." He did. Davin was quiet for a long moment afterward. "Good people," he said eventually. "Yeah, Kale. Yeah, I want to watch the sunrise from the lake. When we get back. The early one, before it's all the way up. The one that comes in at the angle where it hits the water, and you can't tell which is the sky and which is the reflection. Yeah, we'll do that." "Okay." A pause. "I'm going to be quiet for a bit. I have some things to think about. Take your time. The ship moved through transit, and the stars smeared their light across the outside of the hull. And inside the hull, a man lay on his bunk with his eyes open and felt the quiet of a mind at work beside his own mind, the constant companionship of the person he'd known, since before either of them had words for knowing someone, still present, still thinking, still Davin. Category 1. They'd done it the long way, the careful way, the way that required patience and precision, and a fundamental refusal to accept that the categories assigned to you by people who hadn't taken the time to understand you were accurate. The way that required showing up for 11 years in rooms that had been constructed by other people for other purposes and treating those rooms as places where things could be genuinely built. The way that required being willing to reveal the hand when the moment actually demanded it, fully and without hedging, because the studied ambiguity that had protected you during the vulnerable period was not a permanent state but a temporary one. A posture held only as long as it was needed and released the moment it was no longer the right tool. The galaxy was very old and had seen many species make their way into it. Most of them had done it through military dominance or through being absorbed into the structures of a more powerful neighbor, or through the slow accumulation of trade relationships that eventually calcified into political standing. A few had done it through the production of something irreplaceable, a technology, a resource, a cultural output that made other species unwilling to exclude them. Humanity had done it differently. Humanity had done it by being, quietly and persistently, and with no announcement whatsoever, genuinely interesting, by caring about the answer to questions that served no strategic purpose, by building relationships that were not transactional, by treating the compact's political structures not as a system to be exploited, but as a system that could be made better if enough people were willing to do the unglamorous work of being present in the difficult rooms and by, when necessary, stealing a Veth shuttle. Covenant Blade crossed the last transit point and emerged into the Sol system, and Earth appeared on the forward sensors as it always appeared. A pale point of light that grew slowly into a blue sphere mottled with white, remarkable for no geological reason that would interest any xenobiologist from a species that had not originated there, unremarkable by every metric that the compact's category system measured, and completely irreplaceable for reasons that had nothing to do with metrics. "There it is," Davin said. "There it is," Kale said. They came home on a Tuesday morning. The lake was still there. The light came in at the angle they remembered, the early one, before the sun was all the way up, hitting the water from the east, so that the sky and the reflection became confused with each other, a doubling that made the world briefly seem like more of itself. Kale sat on the dock with his feet over the edge and his boots beside him and a cup of coffee going cold in his hand, and the air tasted like water and pine and the particular clean metal smell of a morning that had just finished being night. He didn't say anything. Davin didn't say anything either. For a long time, the light moved. The sky sorted itself out from its reflection. A bird landed on a branch 10 meters away and regarded the dock with the specific suspicion of a creature that had learned that humans sometimes had interesting things in their pockets. "It's good," Davin said finally. "Yeah, I was worried it would feel different. It doesn't. No." A pause. "It really doesn't." The coffee was fully cold. Kefil drank it anyway, because cold coffee in the morning by a lake was not a problem that required solving. The bird moved to a closer branch. The light settled into mid-morning. Somewhere behind him, in the house at the top of the dock, his mother was making something that smelled like the particular breakfast she made when she was happy that people were home. He thought about the council chamber, about Priya's 12-minute presentation, about the Lethari turning in their seat after 11 years of silence, about 47 species processing the fact that their model had been wrong and that the actual situation was more interesting than the model. He thought about 7 cases in foam packaging and the particular silence of Davan's voice when the scale of it had become clear. He thought about a restraint field calibrated for someone other than what he was, and the gap in the housing that had been there, because the tolerances allowed it, and the way most of what had happened in the past 2 years came down to that. Gaps in assumptions, tolerances that had been set by people who hadn't spent enough time understanding the subject. The bird flew away. The lake was still. What happens now? Davin asked. Kakael thought about it. The Lethari formal talks were scheduled for next month. The expanded UEDF intelligence framework was being rebuilt from the ground up, with the integration in mind rather than the secrecy. The companion protocol's future was under review. There were, as of last week, 14 other officers with active neural lattices, all of them in different configurations, all of them reporting experiences that were different from Kale's, but recognizably related. A whole new framework of what it meant to carry someone with you. The UEDF's Medical Ethics Board was still working through the implications. They would be for a long time. There was a lot of work. More of the same, he said. The work. Good work, though. Yeah, good work. The morning moved through itself. His mother called from the house. He stood up, picked up his boots, and walked back up the dock toward the smell of breakfast and the sound of his parents' voices, and the unremarkable Tuesday morning of a planet that had just finished becoming something it had always intended to be. He was home. They were both home. That was enough, and more than enough, and the kind of thing that doesn't require announcing because it announces itself. In the light on the water, in the cold coffee, in the bird that had regarded the dock and found nothing threatening in it, in the specific quality of being alive on a Tuesday, in the place that made you and that you had carried with you, in everything you'd done, and everything that had kept thinking even in the dark, all the way back to this. 3 weeks after the lake, Kale was back on Vareth Prime for the first of the Lethari formal sessions. He hadn't expected to be the UEDF's primary representative for those. That would normally be Priya's domain, or someone from the diplomatic corps, whose training was specifically in first contact frameworks. But the Lethari had made a specific request. They had asked for the officer with the neural lattice. The request had come in through channels that technically didn't exist yet in the new diplomatic architecture, which was itself notable. The Lethari had apparently been maintaining their own information networks in the compact's political infrastructure for considerably longer than anyone had realized, and the ability to route a communication through non-standard channels directly to UEDF Intelligence Command was the kind of capability that politely suggested their presence in the compact's affairs was more substantial than their public posture indicated. Kale thought, reading the request, that he and the Lethari were probably going to get along. The session room was smaller than the council chamber. A working room, not a ceremonial one, with plain composite walls, and a table that was scaled for multiple species, and a light level that the Lethari had specified, and that turned out to be slightly lower than human optimal, and slightly higher than the complete darkness that human biology associated with night, an accommodation, a deliberate one. The observer arrived with 2 others who had not been named in the request. All 3 were the particular shape of the Lethari that KL had seen in the council chamber. Tall, bilaterally symmetric, with something about the way they moved that was just slightly off phase with human movement. The quality of a creature that had evolved in an environment where time moved at a marginally different rate. He did not know if that was physically accurate. It was how it felt. He sat. They sat. He waited. The observer spoke first. The translation system had been set to maximum nuance mode, which took longer but produced higher fidelity output. The first statement took 4 seconds to render. "We want to explain something," it said, "about why we have been silent." Kale folded his hands on the table and listened. What followed was not quite an apology, and not quite an explanation. It was something older than both, the kind of statement that a species makes when it has been holding a position for long enough that the position has become part of its identity and it is choosing to move. The Lethari had been observers at the compact for 6,000 years. They had been observers by choice, not by limitation. Their technical and political capabilities were, as far as the UED's intelligence assessment could determine, roughly equivalent to the Veth Compact as a whole. They had chosen silence because they had seen what happened when very old species attempted to guide younger ones, and what happened was almost always some version of the same story, and they had decided that story was not theirs to participate in. But humanity, the observer said carefully, was not a younger species, in the sense the Lethari had been using the term. Younger in contact time with the Compact, yes, younger in interstellar capability, but not younger in the sense that mattered to the Lethari. Not younger in what the observer called duration of self-reckoning, by which the translation system eventually rendered as something like the length of time a species has been thinking hard about what it is. Taught humanity had been thinking hard about what it was for a very long time. The Lethari had been watching. They had watched humanity invent writing and use it immediately to tell stories about itself, to question itself, to argue with itself across centuries. They had watched humanity develop philosophy and science and religion and art, and deploy all four simultaneously as attempts to understand the same set of questions from different angles. They had watched humanity build and destroy and rebuild with a consistency of purpose that was genuinely unusual, not the consistency of a species that had found the right answer and was following it, but the consistency of a species that was committed to the search itself, that had decided the search was the point. They had watched humanity approach its own mortality with a stubbornness that was, in the Lethari's assessment, the single most distinctive characteristic of the species. Not the grief itself, which most species had, but the refusal to let the grief be the end of the sentence. The habit of making something from it, of looking at the hardest limit and deciding to build something that went past it. The neural lattice, the observer noted, was a specific example of this, but it was not the first example, and it would not be the last. We have been waiting, the observer said, for 62 years, since we first detected your radio transmissions. For the moment when you would be in a position to have this conversation, we did not want to approach you before you had. The translation system paused here, and then rendered the Lethari phrase as, before you had arrived at yourselves. Species that are approached before they have arrived at themselves have a tendency to measure themselves against the expectation of the species that approached them, rather than against their own internal standard. You needed to find out what you were without our definition of it. We were patient. Kale sat with this. Davin, in the lattice, was very quiet. The particular quiet of someone who is listening to something important and does not want to miss any of it. 62 years, Kale said, since the first radio transmissions. 62 of your years. We are aware this is a long time in human terms. It's 2 human generations. Yes, we know what that means for your species. We are sorry for the patience required. We did not believe there was a better approach. Kale thought about his parents, about the specific weight of 2 generations, about his grandparents, who had been alive when the first compact contact was made, who had watched the 11 years of careful diplomacy from the ground level of a species that had been told it was Category 3 and had needed to trust that the people in the rooms were handling it, about the children who would be born into a Category 1 humanity, who would grow up with the fact of galactic citizenship as part of their ordinary world, who would not remember the studied ambiguity, or the careful years, or the 12-minute presentation, who would simply live in what those things had made possible. He thought about what the Lethari were offering now. Not guidance, not absorption, not the story of a younger species being brought along by an older one. Something more like recognition, peer acknowledgement from the oldest witnesses in the room. What do you want from us? He said. The observer's expression, as much as Kale could read it, had the quality of something that had been anticipated and was being met. Conversation, it said. We have been very interested in what you think about things. We have our own answers to some of the questions you are still asking. We think you may have answers to questions we have stopped asking. That seems like the basis for a useful exchange. Davin made a sound in the lattice that was not quite words, the neural equivalent of a slow exhale, the release of something held tightly for a long time. I think, KL said, that we can do that. Good, said the observer. And then, with the precision of a species that had been paying very close attention for 62 years, tell us about the lake. Kale stared at them. How do you know about the lake? You were thinking about it clearly enough that your neural interface registered a distinct pattern. We have been working with the pattern signatures of companion protocol lattices since month 2 of the integration process. The lake was very present in the pattern. A pause that the translation system took a moment to render, and then produced as something warmer than the flat formality of the surrounding statements. It seems important. We would like to know about things that are important to your species, the large things and the small things both. Kale looked at the Lethari observer. 6,000 years of watching, 62 years of specific attention, the oldest witnesses at the compact table, the species that had turned in their seat after 11 years of silence to mark the moment as significant. And he thought about a cold cup of coffee on a dock and a bird on a branch, and the light on the water at the angle where the sky and the reflection became confused with each other. Okay, he said. He told them about the lake. He told them about the light and the cold coffee and the bird and his mother's breakfast and the particular quality of being alive on an ordinary morning in a place that was yours. He told them about Tuesday mornings and why they mattered more than people usually admitted. He told them about Davan, the real version, not the briefing room version, not the intelligence assessment version, but the person, the specific and irreplaceable person who had been his brother since before either of them had words for it, and who was his brother still, in the lattice, thinking and talking, and being exactly himself in a new topology. He talked for a long time. The Lethari listened with the quality of attention that only comes from a species that has had 6,000 years to learn how to listen. No interruptions, no parallel processing sounds, no signs of restlessness, just presence. The specific presence of being fully heard. When he finished, the observer was quiet for a moment. This, it said finally, is what we were waiting to hear. Not the council session, not the fleet position, not the 12-minute presentation, which was excellent. A pause that the translation system rendered as something close to warmth. This, the lake on a Tuesday morning, the cold coffee that you drank anyway. The brother who kept thinking, this is the thing that is specific to your species, that cannot be reproduced by any other species model of you, that is completely itself and completely irreducible and completely worth 62 years of waiting to hear. Kale sat with that. Is it going to be in the record? He asked. The lake, the Tuesday morning. Everything that is real goes in the record, the observer said. That is the only rule. He thought that was probably the best answer to most questions. The session went on for 6 more hours. When it ended and the Lethari withdrew, Kale sat alone in the working room for a few minutes, in the light that was slightly lower than human optimal, with the table scaled for multiple species and the composite walls that had held many conversations. Well, Davin said. Well, Kale said. That was something. Yeah. They've been watching since the first radio transmissions. 62 years. They heard grandmother's radio programs. The old ones she used to play at Christmas. Kale had not thought of that. He sat with it for a moment. The specific grandmother, the specific radio programs, the specific Christmases that were decades ago now, and somewhere in a Lethari archive, the signal trace of them, preserved. Everything that is real goes in the record. Yeah, he said. They did. A pause. Then, Davin said, with the exact voice he'd used when they were children, and one of them had figured something out before the other. She would have loved that, you know. I know she would have said something like, finally took them long enough. Kale smiled. Full. This time. Not almost. Yeah, he said, she would've. He stood up. He had a report to file and a communication to send to Priya and a meeting scheduled with the UEDF Cultural Affairs team, who were going to want a full debrief of everything the Lethari had said, and after that, there was a dinner that Captain Voss had organized with the 4 other UEDF officers currently on Vareth Prime, which would be a proper dinner with multiple courses, and probably several hours of the kind of conversation that didn't have a strategic purpose, but was the thing itself. There was a lot to do. There was always a lot to do. He straightened his uniform. He went out into the corridor, where the light was standard, and the sounds of the compact's diplomatic quarter moved through the ventilation and the walls. 47 species, going about the work of sharing a galaxy, and he walked toward what came next with the particular quality of someone who has arrived somewhere they intended to arrive, and who knows the arriving is not the end of it, but the beginning of what the arriving was for. Category 1. 2 human generations. 1 lake on a Tuesday morning. 1 dead man who had never stopped thinking. Everything real goes in the record. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was, as it turned out, exactly what the galaxy had been waiting for. Not the fleet or the drive, system, or the 12-minute presentation, though all of those mattered, but this. A species that had decided, 300,000 years ago, that it was not going to stop, and had kept the decision every day since, in the large things and the small things both, in the cold coffee, and the lake, and the grandmother's radio programs, and the brother who lived in the lattice, and the smile, that 47 species had never been able to read correctly. The smile meant, we already know how this ends. It ends with us still here. It ends with us still going. It ends on a Tuesday morning by the lake, every time.